The hacking cough was the first sound of the morning and the last sound of the night, an echo that defined the walls of their tiny, damp apartment. For Leo, it was the sound of his own failure. He lay on the lumpy sofa, a searing pain radiating from his lower back, a constant, agonizing reminder of the scaffolding that had given way, taking his career and his future with it. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, a scent that clung to their clothes, their hair, and, he feared, to the very lungs of his 7-year-old daughter, Mia. He could hear the faint scratching of a mouse behind the peeling wallpaper, a tiny life thriving in their ruin. His stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot of hunger, a sensation he had learned to ignore, but the thought of Mia's own hunger was a physical blow. He pushed himself up, his spine screaming in protest, his gaze falling on the final. Bruised apple sitting alone on the cracked countertop, a pathetic testament to their destitution. He had to save it for her. He sat at the rickety kitchen table, the wood warped and stained from years of other people's lives. In front of him lay his entire net worth. He counted it for the 10th time. His calloused fingers, once so sure and strong, now fumbling with the worn bills and the dull, heavy coins. $187. The number felt like a judgment. He felt a wave of hot nausea rise in his throat. This wasn't just money. It was a measure of his worth as a father, the flimsy barrier standing between his sick child and the cold, unforgiving streets. A pile of envelopes lay beside the money, a mountain of debt he could never hope to climb. His eyes fixated on the one at the top, the bold, merciless red letters of the eviction notice searing themselves into his mind. The date printed on it loomed, a guillotine set to fall in just 48 hours. His heart began to pound, a frantic, trapped bird beating against his ribs. The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in, squeezing the very air from his lungs. He was drowning, and the surface was impossibly far away. A soft scratching sound drew his attention. Mia sat on the floor, wrapped in a threadbare blanket that swallowed her small frame. A box of broken crayons spread around her. She was drawing, her small face a mask of concentration. Leo's heart constricted in his chest with a pain sharper than any his back could produce. He saw what she was drawing, a bright yellow sun beaming down on a sturdy house with a red door, a plume of smoke curling from the chimney. In front of the house, she had drawn 3 stick figures holding hands, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all with wide, impossible smiles. It was the life he was supposed to give her. The life her mother, before she was taken by a sickness that came too fast, had trusted him to provide. The memory was a fresh, twisting knife in his gut. He felt the familiar burn of tears behind his eyes, but swallowed them down, his jaw tight. He couldn't let her see him break. He had to be strong, even if the strength was a lie he was telling them both. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the eviction notice again. The cheap paper felt cold and heavy, a death sentence written in sterile, legal jargon. Final notice to vacate. The words swam before his eyes, mocking his powerlessness. The usual city noises, the distant sirens, the rumble of a passing train, felt different tonight. They weren't just background noise. They were the sounds of a world moving on without them. A world that had no place for a broken carpenter and his little girl. A cold, creeping dread, more potent than the apartment's chill, seeped into his bones, a paralysis of pure terror. Shelters were a nightmare of sickness and desperation, and he had no one else, no family to call, no friend who could bear their weight. The image of Mia, her small body shivering on a concrete sidewalk, was a horror so profound it stole the breath from his chest. His hands, the hands that had once framed houses and crafted beautiful furniture, clenched into useless, trembling fists on the tabletop. He was utterly, hopelessly alone. Leo forced himself to his feet, each movement a symphony of pain. He limped to the single window, its glass streaked with grime, and stared down at the rain-slicked asphalt below. The neon glow of a bar across the street painted the wet pavement in smears of red and blue, colors of a life he could no longer access. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean of every last shred of hope he had desperately held onto for months. There was nothing left but the bitter, metallic taste of despair. He was a man standing on a cliff's edge, the ground crumbling away beneath his feet. Then he heard it again, a sound that cut through the silence and his own self-pity. Mia's cough. It was weak, wet, and ragged. A sound of suffering. It shattered the last of his composure, and a single, hot tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path through the stubble on his cheek. This is the moment everything changes. The instant a man with nothing left to lose is forced to find a new path. It's in these moments of total darkness that the most incredible stories of survival are born. If you believe in the power of a father's love and want to follow Leo's fight for redemption, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because his journey is just beginning. 3 days after the eviction notice, a different kind of envelope appeared in their rusted mailbox, thin and stark white, amidst the junk mail and the brown, windowed envelopes of his creditors. It felt different in his hand, the paper crisp and expensive, bearing the embossed return address of a law firm in a town he'd never heard of, Black Creek. A flicker of something, not yet hope, but a sharp, painful curiosity, pricked at him. He carried it upstairs, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. A mistake? A final, cruel legal maneuver from his landlord? He felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut as he slid his thumb under the flap, the sound of tearing paper unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The scent that wafted out was not of fresh ink, but of old paper, a dry, dusty smell that reminded him of things long forgotten. He unfolded the single sheet of heavy bond paper, his eyes scanning the dense, formal text, his heart beginning to pound a slow heavy drumbeat against his ribs. The world outside his window faded. The legal jargon was a thicket of thorns, but he hacked his way through it, his finger tracing the words until the core message emerged, stunning him into silence. Inheritance, last will and testament, great-uncle Arthur Vance. The name was a phantom, a whisper from his mother's stories about a reclusive, estranged branch of the family. He had inherited Arthur's entire estate, a cabin and the surrounding 5 acres of land in the remote forests near Black Creek. He read the sentence again, and then a third time, the words seeming to shimmer on the page. A cabin, land, a home, a raw, desperate hope. An emotion he thought had been scoured out of him, clawed its way up his throat. It felt dangerous, this feeling, like a trick, but the alternative was the street. This single piece of paper, this ghost's gift, was the only thing standing between his daughter and absolute destitution. The nausea of despair was momentarily replaced by a dizzying, terrifying surge of possibility. He had a destination. Packing was a swift, brutal affair. There was little to pack. A cardboard box held their few clothes. Another held the broken crayons and Mia's small collection of worn storybooks. He left the mountain of bills on the table, a monument to a life he was desperate to escape. He looked at the grimy walls, smelled the familiar odor of mold for the last time, and felt not a shred of nostalgia, only a grim sense of release. He closed the apartment door behind them without looking back, the click of the lock a definitive final chapter. The long bus ride was an odyssey into the unknown. The stale, recycled air of the coach was a welcome change from the dampness of their apartment. And for the first few hours, Mia's persistent cough seemed to subside. She pressed her face to the window, her eyes wide with excitement, chattering about the new house, the forest, the grand adventure they were on. Her innocent optimism was a fragile shield against his own gnawing anxiety. He held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. The hours bled into one another, marked by the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt. Leo's spine protested with every mile, a hot poker of pain jabbing at his lower back. But he ignored it, focusing on the changing landscape outside. The dense, towering skyscrapers of the city gradually gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to flat, open farmland dotted with lonely silos. Finally, the terrain grew wilder. The hills became steeper, the trees thicker and darker, crowding the edges of the road. He felt a profound sense of leaving the known world behind, a feeling that was equal parts liberating and deeply unsettling. Mia eventually fell asleep, her small head resting on his shoulder, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm that calmed the frantic beating of his own heart. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the encroaching forest seemed to swallow the light, casting long, menacing shadows across the road ahead. The bus was nearly empty now. They were alone. Their stop was not a station, but a lonely, forgotten outpost. A single wooden bench sat beneath a small, rust-eaten shelter surrounded by a sea of gravel. When the bus pulled away, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, the silence that descended was absolute and overwhelming. It was a living thing, broken only by the cold, sighing wind that rustled through the towering pines. The air itself was different here, thin and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It bit at their exposed skin, a stark contrast to the city's humid blanket. The lawyer's crude, hand-drawn map pointed them down a narrow dirt track that seemed less a road and more a faint suggestion of a path, swallowed almost completely by the encroaching wilderness. Leo felt his stomach sink. The sense of isolation was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical weight pressing down on him, chilling him to the bone. They were utterly, terrifyingly on their own, miles from any sign of civilization. The walk was a grueling test of his resolve. The cardboard boxes, which had seemed so light at the apartment, now felt as though they were filled with lead. Every step sent a jolt of agony up his spine. Mia, sensing his struggle, walked silently beside him, her small hand clutching his tightly. The forest was a formidable, living entity. Ancient trees, their branches tangled together like gnarled fingers, formed a dense, suffocating canopy that blocked out what little remained of the afternoon sun, plunging them into a premature twilight. The silence here was different from the quiet of the bus stop. It was deeper, older, filled with the unseen movements of the wild. The only sounds were the soft crunch of their feet on the damp carpet of fallen leaves and the occasional, mournful caw of a distant crow, a sound that seemed to mock their intrusion. Mia's initial awe of the forest had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, wide-eyed fear that mirrored his own growing dread. Then he saw it through a break in the trees, and the fragile ember of hope he had been nursing was instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of cold despair. It wasn't a cabin, it was a skeleton. The structure listed heavily to one side, its central roof beam snapped and sagging like a broken back. Great sections of the roof were gone entirely, leaving its dark innards exposed to the weeping grey sky. The wooden walls, once sturdy logs, were now a grotesque patchwork of silvered, splintered wood and dark, rotting gaps. A single window shutter dangled from a lone rusty hinge, swaying back and forth in the wind with a rhythmic, low-pitched groan like a dying man's last breaths. This wasn't a fixer-upper, it was a ruin. It was a monument to decay. The vibrant red door from Mia's drawing flashed in his mind, a cruel, mocking fantasy against the reality of the splintered, weathered slab of wood that hung askew in its frame. He felt the ground fall away beneath him. He had led them here, to this. As they drew closer, the smell hit them. It was a physical assault, a thick, gagging miasma of rot, of mildew, and of years of accumulated dampness. It was the smell of a place that had been left to die, a scent that clung to the back of his throat and made his eyes water. Underneath it was a sharper, musky odor of animals that had made the ruin their home. Leo felt a surge of hot nausea rise from the pit of his stomach. This wasn't a new beginning. It was a final resting place. He had dragged his daughter from one crumbling box to an even worse one, trading the slow decay of their city apartment for the accelerated decomposition of this forgotten tomb in the middle of nowhere. He glanced at Mia. Her nose was wrinkled in disgust, and her hand tightened its grip on his. He had promised her safety, a home. The bitter taste of his own failure filled his mouth, more potent and suffocating than the stench of the cabin itself. The hope had been a lie, and the truth was so much worse than he had feared. He shoved the rotting door with his shoulder. It resisted, then gave way with a long, drawn-out shriek of scraping wood and rusted metal, opening onto a scene of absolute dereliction. The interior was a pit of shadows and debris, a thick carpet of damp, decaying leaves mixed with dirt and small animal droppings covered the floor. The air inside was heavy and frigid, significantly colder than the forest, and so saturated with moisture that it felt like they were trying to breathe underwater. What little furniture remained was in a state of skeletal collapse. A three-legged chair lay on its side, its wood soft and spongy with rot. A crude table in the center of the room was draped in a thick, ghostly shroud of cobwebs, so dense it obscured the surface beneath. He felt Mia flinch beside him, pressing her face into his leg. The hope wasn't just dead, It had been murdered and left to rot in this very room. He felt a hollowness spread through his chest, a vacuum where his heart used to be. Leo's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and his gaze was drawn upward. A massive, jagged hole gaped in the center of the roof, a wound torn open to the sky. Through it, he could see the dismal, overcast heavens, and a slow, steady drizzle of rain descended into the room. The drops landed with a soft, rhythmic patter in a large and dark puddle of mud and filth that had formed on the wooden floorboards. The constant, monotonous sound of the dripping water was like a slow, maddening torture, a liquid clock ticking away the seconds of their misery. It was the sound of the house slowly dissolving, returning to the earth. He pictured the coming winter, the snow that would pile up in this very spot, the freezing winds that would howl through the countless gaps in the walls. This structure wasn't merely uninhabitable, it was a danger. A cold dread, entirely separate from the room's chill, crept up his spine. This place would not shelter them. It would consume them. A sharp, ragged cough tore from Mia's small chest, the sound echoing unnaturally in the dead, silent space. The penetrating dampness had already found its way into her vulnerable lungs. He looked down, and his heart fractured. Her face, which had been alight with the thrill of adventure just an hour ago, was now pale and drawn. Her eyes, huge in the gloom, were filled with a raw, undisguised fear that reflected his own internal terror. She buried her face deeper into his trousers, her tiny body trembling. "Daddy, it's scary," she whispered. Her voice so small it was almost carried away by the wind whistling through the walls. The words were a physical blow. He had promised her a new home, a safe place. He had sold her a dream and delivered a nightmare. The crushing weight of his guilt became a physical pressure in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He was a fool, a desperate, foolish man who had gambled with his daughter's life and lost catastrophically. He had to do something. He couldn't let her see the utter despair that was threatening to swallow him whole. "It's okay, Mia Bear," he forced himself to say, his voice sounding hollow and false in his own ears. "It's just a little old. We're a team, right? We can fix it up." The lie was a bitter pill. He let go of her hand and moved stiffly toward the far wall, his back screaming in protest. The only part of the cabin that looked remotely solid was the immense stone fireplace. It was a brute of a thing, built from massive, dark stones dragged from some ancient riverbed. But its gaping maw was choked with a compacted mass of old leaves, debris, and the tattered remains of a bird's nest. There was no woodpile, no kindling, nothing to fight back the encroaching cold. As the last of the daylight died, the oppressive darkness of the forest began to pour into the cabin, and with it came a deep, bone-aching chill that promised a brutal night ahead. As night sealed them in, the forest came alive with sound. The wind moaned through the hole in the roof, a low, keening sound like something in mourning. The branches of the surrounding trees scraped and scratched against the outer walls, their sounds like the dry tapping of long, bony fingers trying to find a way in. A constant, unnerving rustle came from within the walls and beneath the floorboards, the secret movements of countless small creatures. Leo's city-dulled senses were now on high alert, and every snap of a distant twig sounded like a deliberate footstep, every hoot of an owl like a warning. The profound isolation he'd felt earlier now transformed into a palpable, menacing presence. There was no phone signal, no car, no neighbors for miles. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. If Mia's cough got worse, if one of them fell ill or got injured, there would be no help. No one would even know they were gone. They had simply vanished from the world. He found the most sheltered corner of the room, away from the dripping water and the worst of the drafts, and pulled their single, thin blanket around both of them. It offered pitifully little protection against the invasive cold. He tried to use his own body as a shield, holding Mia tightly against his chest, but he could feel her small frame shivering uncontrollably. The dampness was a living entity, seeping through their layers of clothing and sinking deep into their bones. Leo's back, already a source of chronic agony, now throbbed with a dull, relentless pain that was magnified by the pervasive chill. He closed his eyes and listened to the miserable symphony of their new home, the steady drip, drip, drip from the ceiling, the groan of rotting wood, the incessant scuttling of unseen things in the dark. The memory of the lawyer's letter, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a cruel joke. a lure that had led them into this desolate trap. This, he knew with a soul-crushing certainty, was rock bottom. Their squalid apartment, with its leaking pipes and the constant threat of eviction, seemed like a lost paradise in comparison. At least there they had a working light bulb, a tap that produced water, and the comforting, anonymous noise of other human lives. There, they were poor, but they were still part of the world. Here, they had nothing, just the raw, primal elements, the cold, the dark, and a solitude so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing the air from his lungs. He held his shivering daughter closer, his chin resting on the top of her head, and stared into the impenetrable blackness of the ruin. The letter from his great-uncle hadn't been a lifeline. It was a tombstone. He had reached the absolute end of his journey, a place beyond mere desperation. And now the only thing left was the animal instinct to somehow survive until morning. Hours crawled by in the suffocating darkness, each one colder and more menacing than the last. The wind outside had risen to a relentless howl, a mournful beast clawing at the cabin's weak points. Inside, the only sounds were the maddeningly steady drip of water from the roof and Mia's small, shivering gasps as she slept fitfully in his arms. Her cough had settled into a wet, rattling sound in her chest that terrified him, a physical manifestation of the damp chill that had invaded their bones. He felt the cold, not just on his skin, but as a deep, internal ache that settled in his joints and magnified the constant, fiery torment in his lower back. He wrapped the threadbare blanket tighter around them, a useless gesture against an enemy that was already inside the walls. The profound silence between the gusts of wind was worse, a void filled with the crushing weight of his failure. He had brought his daughter to a place where hope came to die, and he could feel the life being slowly leached from them both. The desperation for warmth became a primal, undeniable urge, eclipsing even his hunger and pain. It was a physical need as urgent as air. He couldn't let Mia shiver through the entire night. Her fragile health wouldn't withstand it. His eyes were drawn again to the monstrous stone fireplace, their black, gaping mouth filled with filth. It was their only chance, however slim. He gently eased Mia from his lap, tucking the blanket around her sleeping form before pushing himself to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest, his spine sending a jolt of white-hot agony through his body, but he ignored it. The image of Mia's pale face and the sound of her labored breathing fueled a new, desperate resolve. He had to make a fire. He had to fight back the cold. He would tear this ruin apart with his bare hands if it meant producing a single, life-giving flame. He stumbled towards the hearth, his body moving on pure, paternal instinct, a father's last stand against the encroaching darkness. He began the grim task of clearing the chimney's throat, his bare hands scooping out handfuls of cold, damp mulch. It was a disgusting mixture of rotted leaves, bird droppings, and clumps of what felt like animal fur, all matted together into a solid, foul-smelling plug. The dust and soot filled the air, making him cough, the acrid taste coating his tongue. A small, skeletal mouse, long dead, tumbled out with a scoop of debris, and he flinched back, a wave of revulsion washing over him. This fireplace hadn't seen a fire in decades. The task was monumental, perhaps impossible, but it was an action. It was something to do other than sit in the cold and wait for the morning that felt a lifetime away. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the storm of fear and self-loathing in his mind. He worked with a frantic, focused energy, a man possessed, clawing at the cold, dead heart of the cabin in a desperate bid to spark it back to life and prove he wasn't completely useless. After what felt like an hour of grueling labor, he had cleared a significant portion of the blockage, his arms and face streaked with black soot. Exhaustion finally washed over him, a heavy, leaden tide that made his limbs tremble. He sagged against the massive stone structure, his breath coming in ragged pants. He leaned back, resting his head against the cold rock, and let his right hand fall to the hearth, his palm flat against the wide, smooth slab of stone that formed its base. He closed his eyes for just a moment, a brief respite from the relentless misery, and then he felt it, a jolt, not of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock, shot up his arm. It was a sensation so impossible, so utterly out of place in the frigid tomb of a cabin, that his mind refused to process it for a second. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The stone. He stared at his palm, then back at the hearth. The stone beneath his hand had been warm. His first thought was that he was losing his mind. Maybe it was the cold, the exhaustion, the hunger. Maybe he had a fever and his own body heat was playing tricks on his senses. The idea was almost comforting in its rationality, but the sensation had been too distinct, too real. It was not the searing heat of a live fire, but a deep, pervasive warmth, the kind a stone retains for hours after the embers have died. Hesitantly, as if approaching a sleeping animal, he reached out again. He pressed his palm flat against the same spot on the hearthstone. There it was, undeniable, a solid, radiating warmth that seemed to emanate from deep within the stone itself. It was a pocket of impossible heat in a universe of absolute cold. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the temperature, traced a path of ice down his spine. The air in his lungs seemed to freeze. This warmth defied every law of logic. This cabin had been abandoned for 30 years. No fire had burned here. So where was this heat coming from? A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than his dread of the elements, seized him. It was the primal fear of the unknown, the terrifying realization that his assumptions about this place were fundamentally wrong. The cabin wasn't just empty and derelict. It was occupied, or it had been. Very, very recently. The thought made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The scratching sounds from the walls, the snap of a twig in the woods. They were no longer the random noises of a wild place. They were now filtered through a lens of paranoia. Someone had been here. Someone had built a fire in this very fireplace, and recently enough for the hearth to still hold its heat. He looked over at Mia, a lump of ice forming in his stomach. Her small form, wrapped in the blanket, seemed impossibly vulnerable. They were not alone. The isolation that had felt like a crushing weight just moments ago now felt like a terrifying lack of witnesses. Who would come to a place like this, and why? The instinct to flee was a powerful, screaming siren in his mind. Grab Mia, run back into the freezing woods, away from whoever had been in this cabin. But where would they go? Back to the lonely road? Back into the merciless cold that he was trying to escape? No. The logic was a cruel trap. The danger outside was certain. The danger inside was still a mystery. And this mystery, this impossible warmth, was a thread. In a world where he had nothing, this single, inexplicable fact was something to hold on to. A surge of adrenaline, born of fear and a desperate, burgeoning curiosity, cut through his exhaustion. He had to know. He had to understand. This warmth was a clue. The first sign that there was more to this dilapidated cabin than just rot and decay. He moved with a new purpose. His previous despair burned away by the heat of 1,000 unanswered questions. He turned his full attention back to the hearth, his senses now heightened, every nerve ending alight. He began a more methodical examination, running his trembling fingers over the entire surface of the hearth, a collection of large, flat stones fitted together like a crude jigsaw puzzle. Most were icy to the touch, their surfaces gritty with soot and age, but the warmth was concentrated in one specific area, covering a single large, rectangular stone in the center. The heat was uniform across its surface, a steady, low-grade temperature that felt like a living thing sleeping just beneath the rock. He pressed his ear to it, but heard nothing but the pounding of his own blood. He knelt, his bad back momentarily forgotten, his eyes scanning the seams around the warm stone. The mortar was old, crumbling in most places, but around this particular stone, it looked different. It was darker, fresher, with fine hairline cracks that suggested it had been disturbed. It wasn't part of the original construction. It was a patch, a cover. Someone had sealed this stone in place. His heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm. He pushed on the stone with the heel of his hand. It didn't budge, but when he shifted his weight and pushed downward on the far edge, he felt it. A minuscule give. A tiny, almost imperceptible tilt, accompanied by the faint grinding sound of stone scraping against stone. It was loose. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a warm stone, it was a lid, a cover for something hidden. He looked around the derelict room for a tool, anything to use as a lever. His eyes landed on a heavy iron poker lying amidst the debris he'd pulled from the chimney, miraculously intact despite its rust. He grabbed it, the cold, rough metal, a solid and reassuring weight in his hand. He took a deep, steadying breath, the dusty air filling his lungs, and wedged the tip of the poker into the fresh seam around the stone. This was it. This was the moment the story of this place would begin to unravel. He put his weight into the poker, using the adjacent stone as a fulcrum. The metal groaned in protest, and for a moment, nothing happened. He repositioned it, found a better purchase, and leaned into it with every ounce of his strength. The pain in his back flared, a hot, sharp protest, but he gritted his teeth against it. His focus narrowed to the single point of contact between the iron and the stone. Then, with a low, grating shriek that echoed in the deathly quiet cabin, the seal broke. A crack appeared, widening as he pushed, dust and bits of dried mortar falling into the dark gap. The sound was deafeningly loud, and he froze, glancing over his shoulder at Mia. She stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, but didn't wake. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The world had shrunk to this single task, this single stone. With a final, agonized groan of resistance, the heavy slab tilted upward, exposing the darkness beneath. He worked his fingers into the gap, the rough stone biting into his skin, and lifted. The stone was heavier than he'd anticipated, a dead weight that strained his already screaming muscles. He grunted with the effort, dragging it sideways until it was clear of the opening, and there it was, a perfectly square, dark cavity, about 2 feet wide, hollowed out from the earth beneath the cabin's foundation. It was a secret compartment, hidden in the one place no one would ever think to look. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a mixture of physical exertion and the sheer, heart-stopping implications of his discovery. From the dark hole, a smell wafted up. Not the damp odor of the cabin, but a different scent. The dry, sterile smell of dust, old paper, and the faint, sharp tang of cold metal. It was the smell of a time capsule, of secrets intentionally buried and long undisturbed. He knelt at the edge, his shadow falling into the black square, his mind reeling. Peering into the darkness, he could just make out a shape at the bottom. It was rectangular, with a dull, non-reflective surface. He reached a hesitant hand into the cold, still air of the cavity, his fingers brushing against something hard, cold and smooth. His touch was met with the unmistakable feel of metal. He gripped the object. It was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted it out of the hole and placed it on the dusty floorboards beside him. It was a box, a simple, black metal box, like a military footlocker or a fireproof safe for documents. It was scuffed and scratched, but utterly solid, its surface cool and impassive. There was a single, heavy-duty latch on the front, but no visible lock. The simplicity of it was somehow more menacing than an intricate system of locks would have been. This box wasn't designed to be showy. It was designed to endure. It was designed to protect its contents from time, from rot, and from fire. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him. This box was the reason for the warm stone. Whoever had been here was not just passing through. They were either looking for this box or checking on it. The warmth meant they had been here tonight, or perhaps the night before. They had built a fire, perhaps to ward off the same cold he was fighting, and in doing so, had left behind this single damning clue of their presence. He was no longer just a trespasser in a derelict cabin. He was an intruder who had stumbled upon a secret someone was willing to brave this desolate wilderness to protect. A cold spike of fear lanced through him, far more potent than the chill in the air. What had he found? And more importantly, who would be coming back for it? He felt a sudden, urgent need to see what was inside, to know what kind of danger he had just invited into his and Mia's life. His fingers trembled as he reached for the latch. It was stiff, resisting his initial pull. He had to use both hands, his muscles straining, until it finally gave way with a loud metallic click that seemed to reverberate through the entire structure. The sound was so final, so definitive. It was the sound of a door being opened that could never again be closed. He lifted the heavy lid. The hinges creaked, a low, mournful sound, and the interior of the box was revealed. There was no gleam of gold, no immediate treasure. Instead, the box was tightly packed with just 3 items, each one nestled securely, hinting at their importance. On top lay a thick, leather-bound book, its cover dark and worn smooth with age and handling. Beside it, a collection of papers, rolled and tied with a faded piece of twine, looked brittle and ancient. And tucked into the corner was a small, unassuming pouch made of dark velvet, drawn shut with a thin, fraying cord. The air filled with the scent of aged paper and leather. He reached for the velvet pouch first, his curiosity overriding all other thoughts. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as he lifted it, he felt the shifting weight of solid, hard objects within. His heart hammered in his chest. With clumsy, fumbling fingers, he loosened the drawstring and tilted the contents into his calloused, grimy palm. They didn't sparkle. They didn't glitter like the jewels in a storybook. Instead, a handful of dull, greasy-looking stones tumbled into his hand. They were of varying sizes, some as small as a pea, one as large as the tip of his thumb. They were cloudy, with an oily sheen, and had the rough as uncut look of raw minerals freshly pulled from the earth. He didn't need to be a geologist to know what they were. The weight, the texture, the sheer unlikelihood of their existence in this place. They were diamonds, raw, uncut diamonds, a fortune, a life-altering, terrifying fortune, lying in the palm of his hand in a rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere. A wave of vertigo washed over him, and he had to place a hand on the floor to steady himself. The cabin, the cold, the eviction notice, it all seemed to belong to another lifetime. The scale of his reality had just been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. This was not a lost wallet or a lucky find. This was the kind of wealth that people killed for. The warmth of the hearthstone suddenly took on a new, sinister meaning. Whoever was searching this property wasn't looking for a box of old memories. They were hunting for this pouch of stones. The fear returned, sharp and acidic in the back of his throat. He quickly, almost guiltily, poured the diamonds back into the pouch and cinched it tight, his hands shaking so badly he could barely tie the cord. He felt like he was holding a live grenade. This discovery was not a solution to his problems. It was the beginning of a whole new set of them, ones he was terrifyingly ill-equipped to handle. Next, he picked up the rolled-up papers. The twine that bound them crumbled to dust at his touch. He carefully unrolled them on the floor, the old paper crackling in protest. They were maps, a series of old geological surveys of the local area, overlaid with hand-drawn annotations and precise markings in faded ink. His eyes were drawn to a specific area, circled multiple times in red. A small, handwritten note in the margin read, "Kimberlite pipe confirmed, rich deposit." He didn't know the geological term, but the meaning was clear when cross-referenced with the diamonds now hidden in his pocket. This was the source. This land, this worthless, forgotten plot of land, was sitting on top of a diamond mine. The maps were the proof, the key to a treasure of unimaginable scale. He felt a dizzying rush of adrenaline, a dangerous cocktail of elation and pure terror. He had stumbled not just upon wealth, but upon the secret of its origin. Finally, he lifted the leather-bound diary from the box. It felt heavy and dense in his hands, a repository of time and secrets. The leather was soft and worn, and the front cover was embossed with 2 simple initials, A.V., Arthur Vance, his great-uncle, the ghost who had gifted him this nightmare cabin. A sudden, intense connection to the long-dead man pulsed through him. This was his story. He opened the cover. The first page contained a name and a date, written in a neat, confident cursive, Arthur Vance, May 1988. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. He turned the page, and then another. It was a journal, filled with daily entries detailing geological observations, notes on rock formations, and sketches of the surrounding landscape. It was the meticulous record of a man obsessed with the ground beneath his feet, a man who was hunting for something. This diary was the voice of the man who had found the diamonds, and perhaps the story of how he had lost them. He carefully closed the diary, his mind a whirlwind of shock, fear, and 1,000 racing thoughts. He was sitting on the floor of a ruined cabin, his daughter sleeping just feet away, in possession of a secret worth millions. He now understood the impossible warmth of the hearth. Someone knew about the diamonds. Someone had been here, searching for this very box. for this diary and these maps, and they had been here so recently that the stones were still warm. The realization was a punch to the gut. They hadn't found it. He had, which meant they were still looking, and they would be back. The random, faceless threat he had imagined just moments ago now had a clear, terrifying motive. The danger was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a concrete certainty, as solid and real as the cold metal box sitting before him and the raw, heavy diamonds hidden in his pocket. His problems had just escalated from poverty to peril. The discovery had changed everything. The oppressive cold, the gnawing hunger, the pain in his back, it all faded into the background, replaced by a single, sharp focus. He was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He was now a player in a game he didn't understand, holding all the cards and not knowing any of the rules. The weight of the secret was immense, far heavier than the box or the stones themselves. He looked at the maps, the diary, and the pouch of diamonds. This was evidence. This was a story of a hidden treasure and, he suspected, of a dark crime. The name of his great-uncle, Arthur Vance, was no longer just a phantom from his mother's past. He was a man who had discovered a fortune and had hidden it, a man whose presence still lingered in this cabin like the residual warmth in the stone. Leo felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He had to know what happened to Arthur. He had to understand the story held within these pages. He carefully placed the diary, the maps, and the pouch of diamonds back into the metal box. The click of the latch closing was a sound of finality. He had crossed a threshold. He couldn't unknow what he now knew. He couldn't unfind what he had found. He then slid the heavy box back into the dark cavity beneath the hearth, his movements swift and silent. He felt a desperate need to hide the evidence of his discovery, to erase his own footprints. He dragged the heavy hearthstone back into place, wincing as it scraped across the floor. It settled into its recess with a dull, heavy thud. The fit wasn't perfect. A small, jagged seam remained that wasn't there before, a subtle but undeniable sign that it had been moved. He swept dust and debris over the crack, trying to camouflage it. But in his own mind, the disturbed stone glowed like a beacon, a screaming announcement of the secret it held. He stood up, his body trembling, not from cold, but from a profound, deep-seated shock. He looked around the derelict cabin, but he no longer saw it as just a ruin. It was now a crime scene, a treasure vault, a place of secrets and ghosts. The dripping water, the groaning wood, the howling wind, they were no longer just the sounds of decay. They were the whispers of a violent history that he had just unearthed. The immediate problem of surviving the night had been supplanted by the far larger, more terrifying problem of surviving this discovery. Who was Silas Blackwood? The man his great-uncle's diary would soon reveal. And what would a man like that do to a broken carpenter and his little girl to reclaim his lost fortune? The questions hung in the cold, dark air, promising a dawn that would bring not relief, but a whole new kind of danger. He was a man holding a lightning rod in the middle of a thunderstorm. The impossible warmth that had started this cascade of discovery was now fading from the hearthstone, the last residual heat bleeding out into the frigid air of the cabin. It felt like a countdown. The evidence of the intruder's recent visit was disappearing, but the threat they represented was growing larger and more defined with every passing second. Leo knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that this was only the beginning. He had found the treasure his great-uncle Arthur had died to protect, and in doing so, he had likely inherited not just the diamonds, but the danger that came with them. He looked over at Mia's sleeping form, her small chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. A fierce, protective instinct, more powerful than any fear, surged through him. He had brought her to this dangerous place, and now he would have to become a different kind of man to get her out alive. He moved away from the fireplace, the secret now buried once more, a heavy weight in his mind. He returned to the corner where Mia slept, sinking to the floor beside her. He wrapped the blanket around them both, but the cold he felt now was internal, a dread that no fire could ever hope to warm. He wasn't a carpenter anymore. He wasn't a victim. He was the guardian of a secret, the keeper of a dead man's legacy, and the target of an unknown, powerful enemy. He stared into the oppressive darkness, his ears straining, listening for any sound beyond the wind and the rain. He was listening for footsteps. He was listening for the return of the men who had warmed the stone, the men who would undoubtedly be coming back to find what he now possessed. The mystery had been uncovered, and the next act of this dark play was about to begin, whether he was ready for it or not. The weight of the uncut diamonds felt like a phantom pressure in his pocket, a constant reminder of the paradigm shift in his life. Just hours ago, his greatest concern was $187 and an eviction notice. Now, he was entangled in a 30-year-old mystery involving a potential fortune and, he suspected, a murder. The diary on his lap felt like a sacred text and a confession all at once. He knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that opening it would provide answers. But it would also drag him deeper into a world of danger, from which there might be no escape. The cabin was no longer just a derelict shelter, it was a mausoleum, and he had just disturbed the ghost that haunted it. The open loop of the warm stone had led him here, to a choice between ignorance and a perilous truth. The story of Arthur Vance was waiting, and Leo knew he had no choice but to read on. With the box and its terrible secrets hidden once more beneath the hearth, Leo knew he could not wait until morning. The need to understand was a fire in his gut, more potent than the cold. He retrieved the leather-bound diary, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He sat in the corner beside Mia's sleeping form, using the weak, flickering beam of his cheap keychain flashlight to illuminate the pages. The smell that rose from the book was of time itself, a dry, dusty scent of brittle paper and decaying leather. He felt a profound sense of trespassing as he opened the cover, the spine creaking in the suffocating silence. The handwriting inside was small and precise, the disciplined script of a scientist. A wave of cold dread washed over him as he began to read. The words of a dead man reaching out across 3 decades to pull him into a conspiracy of greed and murder. He felt his heart begin a slow, heavy pounding, a drumbeat for a story that was about to unfold, a story that was now inextricably his own. The initial entries were filled with a palpable, infectious excitement. Arthur Vance wrote with the passion of a man on the verge of the discovery of a lifetime. He detailed his geological theories, the painstaking process of collecting and analyzing rock samples, the thrill of finding indicator minerals. Leo, a carpenter who understood the solid reality of wood and steel, found himself captivated by this language of stones and deep time. Then came the entry that changed everything. Confirmed, Arthur had written, the word doubly underlined, a kimberlite diatreme of significant size. The samples are conclusive. The yield is beyond my wildest projections. Leo could feel the dead man's triumph, the sheer, unadulterated joy of a life's work fulfilled. Arthur wrote of the future, of establishing an ethical mining operation, of the wealth it could bring to the impoverished region. It was a dream, pure and untainted, written on a page just before the nightmare began. Leo felt a pang of sorrow for the man he never knew. The tone of the diary shifted abruptly a few pages later. The scientific observations became interspersed with notes of a more personal, fearful nature. A name appeared for the first time, an innocuous set of initials, S.B. S.B. visited the site today, one entry read. Unannounced. His questions were too specific. He knows I've found something. A new energy entered the writing, a frantic, paranoid tremor. Arthur wrote of feeling watched, of finding footprints near his cabin that were not his own, of the unsettling feeling that the vast, empty forest was suddenly crowded. Leo felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He could hear the faint scratching of a rodent inside the wall, and the sound made him jump. The paranoia of the diary was seeping off the page, poisoning the air around him. The initials S.B. seemed to hang in the darkness of the cabin, a formless threat that was slowly taking shape. The joy of discovery had been replaced by the cold, creeping dread of being hunted. The next entry Leo read was a full page, the handwriting more hurried, the ink slightly smeared, as if written by a trembling hand. S.B. made his move. Silas Blackwood. He came to the cabin this evening. He knows everything. He must have had someone following me for weeks. The name hit Leo like a physical blow. Silas Blackwood, the patriarch of Blackwood mining, a name synonymous with power in this part of the country. He offered me a pittance for the land. Pennies on the dollar. He called it a generous offer to take this worthless rock pile off my hands. When I refused, he smiled. The kind of smile a wolf gives before it strikes. Leo felt the blood drain from his face. The casual cruelty, the predatory confidence of the man was vividly rendered in Arthur's terrified prose. He could almost smell the cloying scent of Blackwood's cologne, see the coldness in his eyes. This was the man who had ordered his men into this cabin, the man who was still looking for this diary, the man whose warmth Leo had felt on the hearthstone. The final entry was short, stark and utterly terrifying. It was dated 2 days after the meeting with Blackwood. The handwriting was almost illegible, a frantic scrawl across the page. "He's going to kill me. I know it. He told me yesterday how treacherous these woods can be, how easily a man can have a hiking accident. It wasn't advice, it was a promise. I have hidden the box, the diary, the maps, the samples, everything. If you are reading this, it means I failed. It means he won. Do not let him have it. The truth is in this box, avenge me." And that was it. The rest of the diary was blank. The words hung in the air, a final, desperate plea from the grave, a hiking accident. The official story, the lie. Leo felt a suffocating wave of nausea. He closed the diary, his hands numb. The ghost of the cabin now had a name, a story, and a murderer. And the murderer knew this land, knew its secrets. Gant was still hunting for the proof Leo now held in his hands. He sat in the darkness, paralyzed, the diary feeling like a lead weight in his lap. He finally understood, the warmth on the stone. The men who had been here were Blackwood's men. They had been searching for this box for 30 years, and they were still searching. They were the source of the impossible heat. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He had stumbled into the middle of a decades-long crime. He was a loose end, a complication in Silas Blackwood's perfect murder. Just then, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound so alien and out of place in this wilderness that it took his brain a moment to identify it. It was the low, powerful rumble of a modern engine growing steadily closer. It wasn't the sputtering engine of a farm truck. It was the smooth, deep-throated growl of expensive machinery. Headlights swept through the trees, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the forest into a landscape of moving monsters. The vehicle was coming down their track. It was coming for the cabin. Leo's heart leaped into his throat, a wild, frantic bird beating against his ribs. He scrambled to his feet, shoving the diary deep into the pocket of his jacket. He looked at Mia, still sleeping, her face serene and innocent. His every instinct screamed at him to grab her and run, to disappear into the dark woods. But where would they go? The car was already here. There was no escape. The engine sound cut off abruptly, plunging the woods back into a shocking, profound silence. A moment later, a car door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thump. The sound was an exclamation point, an announcement of arrival. Then, footsteps. Not the hurried, frantic steps of someone lost, but the slowing, deliberate, confident crunch of boots on gravel and twigs. They were coming toward the cabin. Leo felt frozen, a prey animal caught in the glare of a predator. He was trapped. He backed away from the door, his breath held tight in his chest, his mind screaming. He was utterly, hopelessly exposed. A figure blotted out the faint moonlight in the doorway. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but it was his stillness that was most terrifying. He stood there for a long moment, a dark silhouette against the night, letting his eyes adjust. Then he stepped inside. The man was in his late 60s, with a mane of thick, perfectly coiffed silver hair. He wore a tailored charcoal wool overcoat and gleaming leather shoes, clothes so absurdly out of place in this ruin that they served as a clear statement of power. He didn't belong here, but he owned the space completely. A faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and cigar smoke wafted from him, a sterile smell that fought and lost against the cabin's pervasive odor of rot. His face was weathered but handsome, with a firm jaw and piercing, intelligent eyes that swept over the squalor of the room, cataloguing every detail. His gaze finally settled on Leo, and it was like being weighed and measured by a butcher. This was Silas Blackwood. Quite the fixer-upper, isn't it? The voice was a low, smooth baritone, laced with condescending amusement. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that never needed to be raised. "I'm Silas Blackwood. My property borders this one. I suppose that makes us neighbors." He offered a thin, practiced smile that did not reach his colder, assessing eyes. Leo felt his blood turn to ice. It was him, the man from the diary. The monster was standing in his cabin, Leo's throat was dry, his tongue a thick, useless thing in his mouth. He could feel the weight of the diary in his pocket, a burning secret against his skin. He tried to speak, to say something, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. He simply nodded, his mind a maelstrom of terror and disbelief. Blackwood's gaze drifted past him, into the corner where Mia was bundled in the blanket, and his smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He had seen everything he needed to see. "I'll be direct, son. I knew your great-uncle. A bit of a dreamer, poor fellow. This land, it's worthless. The soil is sour, it's isolated, and this structure, as you can see, is a death trap." He gestured around the ruin with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Frankly, I'd be doing you a favor by taking it off your hands. My company, Blackwood Mining, is consolidating some land in the area for conservation purposes. I am prepared to offer you $5,000. For your trouble." The number hung in the air, a deliberate insult. $5,000 for a property sitting on a king's ransom. It was a test. It was a power play. Leo felt a surge of hot rage, but it was instantly smothered by a cold wave of fear. He had to play the part. He was a desperate man, a broken father. He wasn't a man who had just read a murderer's confession. He had to make him believe the lie. He felt the entire world narrow to this single, terrifying performance. Leo forced himself to look down at the floor, to hunch his shoulders, to become the pathetic, broken man Blackwood saw him as. 5,000, he mumbled, his voice hoarse, letting a note of desperate hope creep into it. I don't know. We have nowhere else to go." He let his voice crack, a performance fueled by the very real terror that was coursing through his veins. He could feel Blackwood's gaze on him, cold and analytical. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat. Leo's mind was racing. He was holding the evidence that could destroy this man, and he had to pretend he was contemplating a handful of charity. Every second felt like an hour. His back throbbed, a familiar pain that was now a grounding force in a world that had tilted off its axis. He had to be convincing. His daughter's life depended on it. He could feel the cold metal of the keychain flashlight in his pocket, a useless talisman against the flesh and blood monster standing before him. Just then, from the corner, Mia let out a weak, rattling cough. The sound cut through the tension like a razor. Blackwood's head snapped toward the noise, his mask of bored civility dropping for an instant. A flicker of something cold and calculating appeared in his eyes. He looked from the bundle of blankets to Leo, his thin smile returning. But this time, it was different. It was predatory. "A little girl," he said softly, the words dripping with false sympathy. "And a cough like that and this damp air can't be good for her. It's a terrible thing for a child to be sick, especially out here. So far from everything, so far from help." Every word was a carefully chosen dart, aimed directly at Leo's most vulnerable point. He wasn't just talking about the cabin's dampness anymore. He was talking about the isolation. He was talking about Leo's powerlessness. He felt a cold spike of pure animal fear for his daughter. This man was not just a murderer. He was a sadist. Blackwood took a deliberate step closer, his polished shoes crunching on the debris-strewn floor. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound that was far more menacing than a shout. "This is a dangerous place, Mr. Vance. The woods are deep. People get lost. Animals. Treacherous terrain. Accidents happen all the time." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked directly into Leo's eyes. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy if another accident were to happen on this property, especially to a family. The emphasis on the word "another" was a physical blow. It was a direct, unmistakable reference to Arthur. It was a confession and a threat delivered in the same breath. My God, he knows. He suspects I might know. The realization struck Leo with the force of a physical impact. He felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just a negotiation. It was a warning, a death sentence, suspended for now. The powerful man straightened up, the moment of intimacy over. He pulled a crisp business card from his overcoat and placed it on the rotting table, the small white rectangle a stark beacon in the gloom. "That's my direct number. Think about my offer. It's more than fair. It's a ticket out of here for you and your daughter. A new start." He looked from the card to Leo, his eyes hard as flint. "You have 24 hours to accept. I'll have my lawyers draw up the papers." He didn't wait for a response. He turned, his coat swirling around him, and walked out of the cabin without a backward glance. The sound of his footsteps faded, followed by the solid thump of the car door and the powerful roar of the engine as it turned and drove away, its red taillights disappearing into the oppressive darkness. He left behind a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any sound, and the lingering, sterile scent of his cologne, a ghost of power and menace. Leo stood frozen, his entire body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated terror. The air felt thick, hard to draw into his lungs. The business card on the table seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. 24 hours. It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. Sign away the land and the secret it held, or he and Mia would become another accident. The man's words echoed in his mind, a death threat wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. The choice was brutally, impossibly clear. A fortune built on justice for a dead man, or the guaranteed safety of his living daughter. His gaze fell on Mia, her small chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Her life was in his hands. The weight of the raw diamonds, the maps and the diary was nothing compared to the crushing weight of this decision. What would you do in his place? Would you risk your child's life to fight a powerful monster for a fortune you never knew you had? Or would you take the deal, surrender the truth, and run as far away as you possibly could? For a long time after the engine noise faded, Leo remained a statue carved from ice and terror. The only sound was the frantic, painful hammering of his own heart and the steady, maddening drip of water from the ceiling. The business card on the table was a white flag of surrender he was being forced to wave. 24 hours. It was a countdown to annihilation. The choice Blackwood had given him was no choice at all. It was a cage. He looked at Mia, her small form so fragile in the gloom, and her rattling cough was the sound of the cage door slamming shut. A cold, hard fury began to burn beneath his fear. It was the rage of a cornered animal, a father with nothing left to lose but the one thing that mattered. He wouldn't sign. He wouldn't surrender Arthur's legacy or his own dignity. He wouldn't let that monster win. But he couldn't stay. To remain in this cabin was to wait for the executioner. His mind raced, grasping for an escape route, a third option in a game with only two. And then he remembered the crude map from the lawyer's office. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, his numb fingers finally closing around the folded, crisp paper. He smoothed it out on the floor, his keychain light casting a weak, trembling circle upon its surface. The map showed his 5 acres, a small, insignificant square, but just to the north, separated by a dense, 2-mile stretch of forest marked only as impenetrable, there was another square, another small plot of privately owned land. It was the only other sign of human existence for what looked like 10 miles in any direction. It was a desperate, insane long shot. Who lived there? A friend of Blackwood? Another victim? He had no way of knowing, but it was a direction. It was a destination other than the grave Blackwood had planned for them. A desperate, wild hope, as sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass, pierced through his terror. They had to go. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Now. Under the cover of the same darkness Blackwood used as a weapon, they would run. They would take the secret and disappear into the night. The decision made, a frantic energy seized him. He moved with a speed and purpose he hadn't felt in years. The pain in his back a dull roar he forced to the background. First, the evidence. He pried up the hearthstone again, the grating sound setting his teeth on edge. He pulled the cold metal box from its earthy tomb, its weight a solid, terrifying reality in his hands. This box was their only leverage, their only shield. It was the reason they were being hunted, but it was also their only hope for justice. He didn't put it in the cardboard box with their clothes. It was too precious, too dangerous. He found a length of old rope in the debris and strapped the heavy box to his own back, cinching it tight. It sat awkwardly against his spine, its hard edges digging into him, a constant painful reminder of the burden he now carried. He then gently scooped Mia into his arms, wrapping her in the thin blanket. Her body was hot, a feverish warmth seeping through his clothes. Her cough was getting worse. Just as he was about to step toward the door, a new sound ripped through the night, freezing the blood in his veins. It was the sound of another engine. But this one was different from Blackwood's smooth, powerful luxury car. This was a guttural, angry roar. the sound of a poorly maintained V8 engine being pushed too hard, its tires spitting gravel as it hurtled down the dirt track. It was coming fast. Too fast. He hadn't even had an hour. Blackwood hadn't given him 24 hours at all. That had been a lie. A cat-and-mouse game to torment him. The real attack was coming now. Panic, pure and undiluted, threatened to swallow him whole. He looked wildly around the ruined cabin. There was nowhere to run. The woods were a black, tangled wall, and the truck was already too close. He was trapped. The headlights slashed through the trees, sweeping across the cabin's empty window frames, and he threw himself and Mia to the floor, behind the crumbling remains of the central table, his heart exploding in his chest. The truck skidded to a stop right outside, the engine cutting out with a final rattling gasp. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. 2 doors slammed, the sound like gunshots in the night. Heavy, crunching footsteps approached, not the measured tread of Blackwood, but the swaggering, clumsy gait of 2 large men. "He ain't gonna be hard to find," a rough voice growled, the sound carrying clearly through the broken walls. Nowhere to go. Leo's mind was a blank screen of white noise. He looked down at Mia, her eyes wide with fear in the gloom, and pressed a finger to her lips, praying she would understand. He scanned the floor desperately, his eyes catching on the corner of a threadbare, rotted rug near the fireplace. Underneath it, he saw a dark line, a seam, and a small iron ring. A cellar door. A root cellar, maybe. It was their only chance. A pathetic, desperate gamble. The footsteps were at the door now, their heavy shoulder about to slam against the flimsy wood. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he scrambled toward the rug, dragging Mia with him. He tore the rug away, revealing a low, heavy wooden trapdoor. The iron ring was cold and rusted in his grip. He pulled. It was swollen with damp, refusing to budge. He could hear the men outside talking, their voices low and menacing. He pulled again, his back screaming, a strangled grunt escaping his lips. The door shifted with a groan of protest. He pried his fingers into the gap, tearing his nails, and lifted it just enough to create a black, narrow opening. A blast of cold, earthy air, the smell of potatoes and damp soil, rose to meet him. "Get in," he whispered fiercely to Mia, pushing her toward the hole. She whimpered but obeyed, her small body disappearing into the absolute blackness. Just as he heard the main cabin door splinter and crash inward, he swung his own legs into the hole, pulling the heavy trapdoor down over his head, plunging them into a suffocating total darkness. The cellar was tiny, a cramped, coffin-like space dug out of the earth. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of dirt and decay. Above them, heavy boots stomped across the floorboards, the sound thunderous and immediate, splintering wood, shattering glass. They were destroying the place. "He ain't here!" the first voice yelled, laced with frustration. Where the hell did he go? A second voice, deeper and calmer, replied, "He can't have gone far. The boss said he's got a sick kid." Leo held Mia tight. His hand clamped gently over her mouth. He could feel her body trembling. A small, terrified bird. He pressed his ear against the underside of the trapdoor, his own breath held tight in his chest, every nerve screaming. The cellar was their tomb, or their sanctuary, and he didn't know which. He could feel the vibrations through the wood as the men overturned the table, kicked apart the rotten chair. They were a force of pure, brutal chaos, a physical extension of Blackwood's will. "Check the fireplace," the deep voice commanded. The old man was always obsessed with that goddamn fireplace. A cold dread washed over Leo. The hearthstone. Had he replaced it properly? Was the seam visible? He heard the heavy scrape of the iron poker on stone, the same tool he had used. He pictured them finding the loose stone, the empty cavity. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it felt like it would break. He felt Mia start to cough, a small, suppressed sound. He pushed her face into his coat, muffling the noise, praying they hadn't heard. The scraping stopped. "Nothing," the first voice grumbled. "It's solid. What now?" There was a pause. Leo imagined them standing in the center of the wrecked room, their frustration mounting. The silence stretched, more terrifying than their violence. He could feel the cold damp of the cellar floor seeping into his clothes, a chilling reminder of their utter vulnerability, trapped in a hole in the ground while monsters walked above. "The boss's orders," the deep voice said, his tone flat and businesslike. He's probably hiding in the woods, listening. Give him the message." The man cleared his throat, and his voice boomed. "Directed at the empty spaces, me, at the dark woods, at Leo huddled in his hiding place. Listen up, Vance. You got lucky tonight, but your time is up. Mr. Blackwood revokes his generous offer. You have 24 hours to sign over the deed and leave this state. If you are still here, or if you go to the cops, we will come back. And next time, we won't be looking for a box. We'll be looking for you, and we will find you and your little girl. Accidents happen out here. Remember your uncle." The threat hung in the air, a poison cloud. It was a death sentence delivered to a ghost, a promise of violence that felt more real than the dirt beneath him. It was no longer about the land. It was about silence. His silence permanently. Leo heard them move toward the door. "Let's leave him a little reminder," the first voice chuckled, a nasty, cruel sound. There was a hissing, aerosol sound, followed by the sharp, chemical stench of spray paint, so strong it filtered through the cracks in the trapdoor. It was a final act of violation, of marking territory like an animal. Then, the heavy footsteps retreated. A moment later, the truck's engine roared to life, a sound of triumphant rage. It tore away, its noise fading back into the oppressive silence of the forest, leaving behind only the smell of chemicals and the echo of their threat. Leo stayed frozen in the darkness, not daring to move, his mind replaying their words over and over. "Remember your uncle." They had as good as confessed. The thought brought him no comfort, only a deeper, more profound terror. They were not just thugs, they were murderers, and they had just promised to make him their next victim. He waited, counting the seconds, which stretched into an eternity of black silence. After what felt like a lifetime, he pushed slowly, tentatively, on the trap door. It lifted. He poked his head out, his eyes scanning the ruined cabin. It was empty. The moonlight streaming through the hole in the roof illuminated a scene of total devastation. Everything was broken, overturned, splintered, and on the far wall, scrawled in huge, dripping red letters, were 2 words, 24 hours. It was a threat painted in the color of blood. A wave of nausea and rage washed over him. He scrambled out of the cellar, the earthy smell clinging to him, and pulled a frightened, whimpering Mia out after him. She buried her face in his chest, her body racked with silent sobs. He held her tight, whispering reassurances he didn't feel, his eyes fixed on the brutal red graffiti. This was his home, his inheritance, and it had been violated, desecrated, but there was no time for anger. The clock was ticking. Their 24 hours had already begun. The race for their lives was on. He moved with a desperate urgency, his earlier plan now a terrifying necessity. He checked the hearth. The men had scraped it, but they hadn't found the loose stone. The secret was still safe. He grabbed the small cardboard box with their clothes and Mia's crayons, a pathetic collection of their worldly goods. With the heavy metal case still strapped to his back and Mia held tight against his chest, he took one last look at the wreckage of Arthur Vance's cabin. It was a tomb now, twice over. He would not be the third man to die on this land. He plunged through the broken doorway and into the oppressive blackness of the forest, not looking back. The forest, which had seemed menacing before, now felt like a potential ally, its tangled darkness a cloak to hide them from Blackwood's hunters. He ran blindly, fueled by adrenaline and terror, his only guide the memory of the map and the single, faint hope of a light in the wilderness. The 2-mile journey to the neighboring property had begun. The forest was a nightmare labyrinth. Thorny branches clawed at his face and clothes, tearing at his skin. Unseen roots snaked across the forest floor, threatening to trip him with every step. The air was frigid, burning his lungs, and the pain in his back was a white-hot fire, intensified by the awkward weight of the metal box and his precious daughter. Mia was a dead weight in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her feverish heat was a terrifying contrast to the biting cold that surrounded them. Every snap of a twig behind him sounded like a pursuing footstep. Every hoot of an owl felt like a pronouncement of doom. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, a man running from monsters through a world of shadows. His lungs were on fire, his legs turning to lead, but he couldn't stop. To stop was to die. The image of the red letters on the wall was burned into his mind, a brand that pushed him onward. He had no idea how long he had been running. An hour? 2. Time had dissolved into a meaningless sequence of pain, fear, and desperate motion. The forest was a relentless, unchanging sea of black trunks and tangled undergrowth. He was losing hope, the initial surge of adrenaline fading into a bone-deep exhaustion and despair. Maybe the map was wrong. Maybe the other cabin was abandoned, another ruin like his own. Maybe he was just leading his daughter to a slower, colder death in the woods. He stumbled, his ankle twisting, and fell to his knees with a cry of pain. The metal box dug cruelly into his spine. He lay there for a moment, defeated, the cold, damp earth sucking the last of the warmth from him. Mia whimpered, a sound of pure misery. He had failed. He had run from one trap straight into another. He was about to give up, to let the cold and the darkness take them, to simply stop. It would be so easy to just close his eyes and let go of it all. Then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, impossibly far away, was a light. A single, tiny, yellow square of light. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It was a window. A window in a house. A home. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The sight was like a jolt of electricity to his soul. It was real. The map was right. There was someone out here, hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him, giving him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He pushed himself back to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his ankle, his back, his lungs. He adjusted Mia in his arms, her small body a precious, fragile burden. "It's okay, baby girl," he whispered, his voice a raw croak. "We're almost there. I see a light." He fixed his eyes on that distant, golden square, a lighthouse in his personal storm, and began to move toward it, no longer running but stumbling, lurching, dragging himself and his daughter toward their last, desperate chance for sanctuary. It was a beacon in the oppressive night. The final stretch was a blur of agony. Every step was a negotiation with his own screaming muscles. He lost sight of the light several times as the terrain dipped and rose, and each time a fresh wave of panic washed over him. The fear that it had just been a hallucination, a cruel trick of his exhausted mind, but then it would reappear, closer this time, brighter. He could begin to make out the dark silhouette of a small structure around it, a cabin. He finally broke through the last line of trees and stumbled into a clearing. There it was, a small, sturdy-looking log cabin, a plume of grey smoke curling from its stone chimney, a warm, welcoming light glowing in its single front window. It looked like the house from Mia's drawing, a perfect, impossible image of safety and warmth. It was so idyllic, so peaceful, that it felt like a trap. But he had no other choice. He had reached the end of his strength. The world was starting to swim at the edges, his vision tunneling. He staggered across the clearing, his legs finally giving out as he reached the small wooden porch. He collapsed against the front door, his energy utterly spent. The metal box on his back felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, pinning him to the ground. He raised a trembling, heavy hand and banged it weakly against the wood, once, twice. The sound was pathetic, a feeble scratching. He tried to call out, but his throat was raw, and only a dry, rasping sound emerged. Darkness was closing in, a soft, welcoming abyss. His last conscious thought was of Mia's safety. He had gotten her this far. He had to trust the person behind this door. He banged his fist one last time, a final, desperate plea, before his strength failed him completely. His head slumped against the cold wood of the door, and the world dissolved into a black, silent void, the warm yellow light of the window. The last thing he saw before everything faded away. He had made it, but his fight was far from over. He awoke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. He was lying on a soft, lumpy sofa, a thick wool blanket covering him. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm orange glow across a room filled with books and maps. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was in a dream. The contrast with the cold, damp ruin he had fled was so profound it felt unreal. Then, memory came rushing back. Blackwood, the thugs, the flight through the woods. He sat up with a jolt, a cry of "Mia!" escaping his lips. A figure moved out of a rocking chair by the fire. It was an old man, tall and wiry, with a face like a weathered map of the very woods outside. His eyes were a startlingly sharp blue, and they regarded Leo with a cautious, intelligent curiosity. "She's all right, son," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, feverish, but sleeping. "I got some broth into her." He nodded toward a small bed in the corner where Mia lay, a peaceful expression on her face. Leo sagged back against the sofa, relief so potent it made him dizzy. He looked at the old man. Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The man took a sip from a thick ceramic mug. "Name's Elias," he said, "and I reckon you're the fella who inherited the old Vance place." He looked Leo up and down, his gaze lingering on Leo's torn clothes and the scratches on his face. "Looks like you had a rough first night." Leo just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Elias's gaze then fell on the metal box which now sat on the floor by the sofa. "That box," Elias said, his voice quiet but intense. "I've been wondering if that thing still existed for 30 years. The statement hung in the air. This was no random stranger. This man knew something. Leo's heart began to pound a new rhythm, not of fear, but of dawning, incredible possibility. He hadn't just found a random sanctuary. He had stumbled into the one place, the one person who might understand the truth of what he'd found. "You knew him," Leo stated, his voice barely a whisper. "Arthur Vance." Elias's face softened, a flicker of ancient sadness in his sharp eyes. "Knew him. Arthur was my only friend out here. We'd play chess every Thursday. He was a good man, a brilliant man, too trusting." He looked into the fire, his mind clearly decades in the past. He was more excited than I'd ever seen him in those last few months. He'd found it, his life's work, his geological jackpot, he called it. Elias fell silent for a moment, the only sound the crackle of the flames. Then he turned his gaze back to Leo, and it was hard as steel. "And then he had his hiking accident. I never believed it for a second. Not for one goddamn second. Arthur was more sure-footed in these woods than a mountain goat. He didn't fall. He was pushed." The conviction in his voice was absolute, a 30-year-old certainty that had never wavered. Elias had been waiting for this moment, waiting for proof. Driven by an instinct he didn't fully understand, Leo opened the metal box. He laid its contents on the floor between them, the pouch of raw diamonds, the annotated maps, and the worn leather diary. Elias knelt, his old joints creaking, and picked up the diary with a reverence that spoke volumes. He ran a trembling hand over the A. Vias embossed on the cover. "His journal," he breathed. "Blackwood never found it." He looked at Leo, his blue eyes boring into him. "Silas Blackwood. He came to see you, didn't he?" It wasn't a question. Leo, stunned into silence, could only nod. He recounted the entire story. Blackwood's visit, the veiled threats, the arrival of his men, the ultimatums scrawled on the wall. As he spoke, Elias listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with every word. When Leo finished, the old man slowly shook his head. "He's getting sloppy, desperate. He never would have shown his own face back in the day." A dangerous fire was lit deep in the old man's eyes. "Why now?" Leo asked. The question that had been tormenting him. Why, after 30 years, is he so desperate? Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Because he's running out of time. For 30 years, this whole region has been a backwater, a blank spot on the map. But the feds have commissioned a new, comprehensive geological survey of this entire mountain range. They're using new technology, stuff that can see deep into the ground. The teams are scheduled to start their work in 3 months. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with an audible snap in Leo's mind. They'll find the diamond pipe, Leo breathed, the realization dawning on him. Exactly, Elias confirmed, his face grim. And if the land is still registered to Arthur Vance's estate, the government will secure it. But if Blackwood can get his hands on the deed first, he can claim prior ownership, claim he'd been planning to mine it all along. Arthur's proof, that diary and those maps, is the only thing that proves he knew about the diamonds before he stole the land. Elias stood up and walked over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room. He lifted the lid, revealing an old, meticulously cleaned service revolver and a worn leather gun belt. "I was the sheriff of Black Creek County for 20 years, he said, his back to Leo. "I was the one who found Arthur's body. I knew it was murder. I started asking questions. Started looking into Blackwood's land acquisitions. I got too close, He paused, his hands resting on the chest. One day, the county commissioner suggested, "I take an early retirement. My pension was tripled. My mortgage was paid off. It was a bribe and a threat all in one. Stay quiet and live comfortably, make a fuss and end up like Arthur. I had a wife and a young son back then, so I took the deal. I've been living with that shame for 30 years, waiting for something to change, waiting for this." He turned around, and in his eyes, Leo saw not a reclusive old man but a lawman whose sense of justice had been dormant, not dead. In that moment, Leo realized he was no longer alone. He had found his ally. The discovery of the diamonds had been a shock. The diary's revelation of murder had been terrifying. But it was Elias's story that finally brought the entire conspiracy into sharp, horrifying focus. Blackwood wasn't just a murderer. He was a king ruling a corrupt kingdom built on fear, and Leo had just thrown a stone at the throne. The 24-hour ultimatum wasn't just about the land. It was about Blackwood's entire empire, which was on the verge of being exposed by the government survey. This was why he was so reckless. He was a cornered animal, and he would do anything to protect his legacy of theft and violence. Leo looked from the determined face of the old sheriff to the sleeping form of his daughter. He had fled for their lives, but he now realized he had run directly into the heart of the fight. There was no running far enough to escape a man like Blackwood. The only way out was through. The only way to protect Mia was to destroy the monster that was hunting them. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but now it was mixed with something new, a grim, steely resolve. Elias saw the change in Leo's eyes. He gave a slow, grim nod of understanding. "You can't run," he said, verbalizing Leo's own thoughts. "A man like Blackwood doesn't leave loose ends. He'd hunt you to the ends of the earth. Our only chance is to bring the whole rotten structure down on his head. And that," he said, gesturing to the box on the floor, "is the lever." The metaphor was apt. Leo, a simple carpenter, now held the one tool that could dismantle the life's work of the most powerful man in the region. The thought was both terrifying and empowering. He was no longer just a father trying to survive. He was the custodian of Arthur Vance's vengeance. He felt a strange kinship with the dead geologist, a man he'd never met but whose final, desperate words from the diary now echoed in his soul. "Avenge me." The plea was no longer just a dead man's wish. It was a mission he had unknowingly accepted the moment he pried that warm stone from the hearth. He looked at Elias, a silent understanding passing between them. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm and comforting sound that was a stark contrast to the cold, hard reality of their situation. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a command bunker. The two men, a broken carpenter and a disgraced sheriff, were separated by 40 years of age but united by a common enemy and a shared purpose. They were a tiny two-man army facing off against a giant. The odds were impossible, suicidal even, but in Leo's hands was a truth so powerful it had been kept buried for 3 decades, a truth that could shatter an empire. He felt the weight of the decision, the sheer, terrifying scale of what they were contemplating. It was one thing to run and hide. It was another thing entirely to stand and fight a man who controlled judges, politicians, and killers. He thought of Mia, her innocent face calm in sleep, and he knew there was no real choice. The path of the coward led to a life of looking over his shoulder, a life of fear. The path of the warrior, however dangerous, was the only one that led to true freedom. "What do we do?" Leo asked, the question hanging in the warm, smoky air. His voice was steady, the tremor of fear replaced by a cold determination. Elias walked to the window, peering out into the blackness of the forest, his hand resting on the wooden frame. "We don't wait for him to come to us," the old sheriff said, his voice low and firm. "We take the fight to him, but not here. This place is too isolated. He controls everything, everyone, in Black Creek. The local police are on his payroll. We need to go over his head. We need to find someone he can't buy, someone he can't intimidate." He turned from the window, his blue eyes glinting in the firelight. "I was a lawman for a long time. I made a few friends in high places, friends who owe me a favor. There's a federal prosecutor in the city, specializes in corporate corruption, a real bulldog. If we can get this evidence to him, if we can tell him this story, Blackwood's reign is over. The plan was simple, audacious, and incredibly dangerous. It meant leaving the relative safety of the cabin and traveling back toward the world Blackwood owned. Just as a sliver of hope began to dawn, a low rumble broke the silence of the night. It was the sound they both dreaded, the sound of an engine. Leo's blood ran cold. He and Elias exchanged a look of pure dread. They moved to the window, peering cautiously through the edge of the curtain. A set of headlights was bouncing down the path toward Elias's cabin. It wasn't the battered truck from before, nor was it Blackwood's luxury sedan. It was a dark, nondescript SUV, the kind favored by government agents or private security. How? How could they have been found so quickly? Leo's mind reeled. Had they been followed through the woods? Was there a tracker on the box? The vehicle pulled to a stop in the clearing, its headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the front of Elias's home, pinning them like insects in a jar. The engine was cut, and the sudden, profound silence was deafening, filled with the promise of imminent, inescapable violence. There was nowhere left to run. The fight had come to them. 2 doors opened and closed. 2 dark figures emerged, their features obscured by the glare of their own headlights behind them. They didn't have the clumsy menace of the thugs from before. These men moved with a quiet, efficient professionalism that was far more terrifying. They didn't rush the cabin. They took positions on either side of the clearing, their purpose clear: containment. One of them raised a hand to his mouth and his voice cut through the night, calm and authoritative, but amplified by a bullhorn that made it sound like the voice of God. Leo Vance, Elias Thorne. We know you are in there. This is your only warning. Come out with your hands empty. The box remains in the house. You have 60 seconds before we make entry. The voice was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of operational fact. This was not a negotiation, it was the end. The professional calm was more chilling than any shouted threat. Blackwood had escalated from brutish thugs to a professional paramilitary force. Leo looked at Elias, his face pale in the firelight. The old sheriff's jaw was set, his eyes burning with a lifetime of suppressed rage. He moved swiftly to the wooden chest and took out the service revolver, its metal gleaming. He checked the cylinder, his movements practiced and sure, the muscle memory of 20 years as a lawman taking over. "They won't take us alive, son," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "They can't afford to have witnesses. This is an extermination." He handed the heavy revolver to Leo. "You know how to use one of these?" Leo shook his head, his hand trembling as he took the weapon. It felt alien and heavy, a cold piece of metal that represented a line he never imagined crossing. "Point and pull the trigger," Elias said grimly, reaching back into the chest and pulling out an old double-barreled shotgun. "They want a war, we'll give them one." The clack of him breaking open the shotgun to check its load was the loudest sound Leo had ever heard. This was it, the final, desperate confrontation. The 60 seconds felt like a lifetime and no time at all. Leo's mind was a whirlwind of terror. He thought of Mia, sleeping peacefully, about to be caught in a violent firefight. He looked at the diary, the maps, the raw diamonds. All of it seemed so insignificant now. Just paper and stones that had led them to this bloody end. The voice from the bullhorn began a countdown. 10, 9, 8. Elias moved to the side of the door, shotgun held at the ready, his old face a mask of grim determination. He was not going to die in shame. He would die on his feet, a lawman to the very end. 7, 6, 5. Leo's hand tightened on the revolver's grip, his finger resting on the trigger. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the countdown. He was a carpenter, a father, and now he was about to become a killer or be killed. The primal instinct to protect his child overrode everything else. If they came through that door, he would shoot. 4, 3, 2. The final moments stretched into an eternity. He closed his eyes, picturing Mia's face. The story was ending here. 1. The word, spoken with metallic finality from the bullhorn, was followed not by a gunshot, but by a deafening crash as the entire doorframe splintered inward. 2 figures, clad in black tactical gear and obscured by helmets and night vision goggles, flowed into the room with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They were not the clumsy thugs from before. They moved like ghosts, their weapons held low and steady, their movements economical and precise. Leo froze. The cold, heavy revolver feeling like a useless lump of lead in his trembling hand. He was a statue of pure terror, his mind unable to process the scene. This wasn't the chaotic violence he had braced for. This was an invasion. A third figure filled the doorway, pointing a laser-sighted rifle not at him, but past him, securing the room. An overwhelming sense of unreality washed over him, a feeling that he had finally broken, that this was a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion, a final, waking nightmare before the end. The air filled with the sharp, clean smell of their gear. Then, a miracle happened. Elias, standing beside him, did not fire. The old sheriff slowly, deliberately, lowered the barrel of his shotgun until its stock rested on the floorboards. A slow, weary grin spread across his weathered face, a sight so incongruous it shattered Leo's paralysis. "Took you boys long enough," Elias grumbled, his voice filled not with fear but with profound relief. The lead tactical officer raised a hand, and the men lowered their weapons. "Roads are a mess." "Sheriff," the officer's voice came through his helmet's calm and professional. "Had to come in quiet. Didn't know what we were walking into." Elias let out a long, shuddering breath. "I made the call the second you fell asleep," he explained to the utterly bewildered Leo. "To an old friend, a promise I cashed in after 30 years. The revolver slipped from Leo's numb fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. The sound was a final, definitive end to his part of the fight. His legs gave out, and he slid to the floor, his body racked with tremors. A woman stepped through the shattered doorway, the chaos parting for her as if by magic. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a tailored suit that seemed impervious to the surrounding squalor. She was the bulldog Elias had spoken of. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the scene, the armed officers, the old sheriff, and Leo on the floor amidst the evidence. She knelt beside him, her expression one of professional empathy. "Mr. Vance, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Kate Riley. You and your daughter are safe now." Her voice was calm, a solid anchor in the swirling sea of Leo's emotions. She looked at the diary, the maps, the small pouch of diamonds. "Sheriff Thorne has given me the broad strokes, but this," she said, her voice filled with a prosecutor's hungry awe, "this is the nail in his coffin." She placed a reassuring hand on Leo's shoulder, and he felt a profound tectonic shift. The crushing weight he had carried on his back and in his soul was no longer his to bear alone. It was being lifted. The fall of Silas Blackwood was not a protracted battle. It was a surgical strike. At 4:37 a.m., as Leo was giving his preliminary statement in the warm safety of Elias's kitchen, a federal tactical team breached the gates of Blackwood's sprawling estate. There was no negotiation. They moved through the opulent mansion, their black gear a stark, brutalist contrast to the silk wallpaper and priceless antiques. They found him not in his bed but in his study, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand as he stared at a wall of security monitors showing the silent, approaching storm. He did not seem surprised, only resigned. The sounds were clipped and professional. "Silas Blackwood, you are under arrest for the murder of Arthur Vance." The clink of handcuffs being ratcheted shut echoed in the cavernous room, a small, metallic sound that signified the collapse of an empire. He was led out past the marble statues and into the cold pre-dawn air, a ghost in his own life, his face illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of true justice. The subsequent investigation was like pulling a single thread that causes an entire tapestry to unravel. Leo's testimony, corroborated by the meticulous details in Arthur's diary, was irrefutable. The raw diamonds perfectly matched the geological profile of the land described in the maps. Arthur Vance's death was officially reclassified as homicide. Emboldened by Blackwood's fall, a floodgate of new witnesses opened. Dozens of families from across the region came forward with stories of intimidation, fraud, and violence, detailing how their own ancestral lands had been stolen to build Blackwood's empire. For Elias, it was a profound vindication. He stood in the courtroom, his back straight, and watched as his friend's name was cleared, the lie of a hiking accident, finally and publicly expunged. The shame he had carried for 30 years lifted like a morning fog, replaced by the quiet, satisfying peace of a promise finally kept, a duty finally fulfilled after a lifetime of waiting for the chance. The legal system, for once, moved with surprising speed. The courts unequivocally affirmed that the 5-acre plot and all its mineral rights were the sole property of Leo Vance, the legal and rightful heir. The news sent shockwaves through the mining industry. Offers poured in, multi-million-dollar bids from massive corporations eager to claim the rich kimberlite pipe. But Leo, guided by Elias's wisdom, refused them all. He chose instead to partner with a smaller, ethical mining consortium known for its commitment to environmental standards and community reinvestment. He remembered Arthur's dream from the diary. The day he signed the final contract, the pen felt impossibly heavy in his hand. The number written on the paper was an abstraction, a string of zeros that his mind couldn't fully grasp. It wasn't the money that made his hand steady. It was the knowledge that this wealth would not be built on greed, but would honor the legacy of the man who had died to protect it, ensuring the whole region would finally benefit. The constant hacking cough that had been the soundtrack to their lives vanished. In its place was the sound of Mia's laughter, a bright, clear sound that echoed in the sterile, sunlit room of the country's best pediatric pulmonary center. The pervasive scent of mold and damp was replaced by the clean, antiseptic smell of healing. Leo sat by her bed, not on a lumpy, broken sofa, but in a comfortable chair, the chronic fire in his back now a dull to a manageable ache thanks to proper medical care. He watched her draw, a box of 64 brand-new crayons spread across her blanket. She was drawing a house again. This one had a huge garden, a dog, and a bright yellow sun with a beaming smile. He felt a familiar burn behind his eyes, but this time it was not from despair. It was the overwhelming, heart-stopping feeling of pure gratitude. He had stared into the abyss, and a dead man's ghost had pulled him back from the edge, handing him the future he had thought was lost forever. Wealth without purpose, he quickly realized, was just another kind of prison. The desperation for money had been replaced by a deep-seated need for meaning. In honor of the man who had saved him, he used a significant portion of his newfound fortune to establish the Arthur Vance Justice Foundation. Its sole purpose was to provide pro bono legal services to families in the region who had been victimized by Blackwood's predatory land grabs. The foundation's office, located in the heart of Black Creek, smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Leo, now dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit, found a new calling. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was a symbol of hope. He would sit with families, listen to their stories, and connect them with the legal team that could fight for them. His hands, once calloused from framing houses, now worked to rebuild lives, crafting futures not with wood and nails, but with the unshakable foundation of justice. The air in his new kitchen was filled with the rich, savory scent of roasting chicken and freshly baked bread, a universe away from the single bruised apple on a cracked countertop. He looked across the large oak dining table, a piece he had crafted himself in his new workshop, its surface gleaming under the warm pendant lights. Elias was there, telling a story, his laughter a gravelly, comforting rumble, and beside him sat Mia, her cheeks full and rosy, her breathing easy and silent, her plate piled high. She had insisted their new house have a red door, just like in her drawing. Outside the dark, menacing forest of his memory was now just the woods, a place where he and Mia took afternoon walks. The agonizing pain in his back was a ghost, a memory. The crushing weight of his failure was gone. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a quiet certitude that he was finally, truly home. He had not just found a fortune, he had found his way back to himself. Leo's journey began with just $187 and the crushing weight of absolute despair. It was a story forged in darkness, a testament to a father's unwavering love and a dead man's cry for justice. He transformed from a broken man waiting for the end into a pillar of strength, a carpenter who learned to rebuild a community, proving that even from the deepest ruin, a new life can be built. His story is a powerful reminder that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters. We all face our own dark woods and our own impossible choices. What would you do to protect the ones you love? If you were moved by Leo's fight for redemption and want to discover more tales of survival, hope, and justice, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories we have waiting for you.